just a brief work background, being a UN Fiji's representative, permanent representative to the UN in Geneva, and also on a new role, congratulations, as the Vice President, the Vice Chair, Vice President, yeah. Vice President of the UN Human Rights Council. And what does that mean for Fiji?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure. To me, there is no better group to really work with this kind of transformational change than young people. So I'm really delighted to talk to this group today. Let me say that Fiji opened it. If one were to ask what is the heart of Geneva, I mean, it is actually the home of the WHO, the ILO, the IPU, the ITU, and a host of other international organizations. But the heart of Geneva is, in fact, the Human Rights Council. And one of the main reasons why Fiji decided to open the mission in Geneva was because of the Human Rights Council. The need to be there, the need to play an active role, and really the need to implement international human rights to Fiji. And we must remember that the Geneva mission was opened in 2014, just a few months after the 2013 Constitution. And the 2013 Constitution has both social and economic and cultural rights, as well as ICCPR rights, civil and political rights. So a really big challenge for Fiji is how do you develop both sets of rights together so that they are interdependent, so that you're not focusing on one set to at the expense of the other set. And how do you actually transform rights? How do you begin to have this conversation? How do you begin to have this conversation, ensuring that people are involved in the conversation? And here I am with a group of young people, but I've often relocating a school, if you're going to do it in a participatory way, whom do you ask in the community? And I think that the children are actually the last subset of people to be consulted if you are relocating a community. They're simply not there in the minds of people. And yet, if you don't consult the children when you're moving a school, you're actually not consulting the main stakeholders. So trying to adjust to this new way of a rights-based transformation was one of the biggest challenges that the Geneva mission had to deal with. So this is a very fundamental transformation. It's not about opening a mission and going and attending a meeting and looking really good in the Fiji sun and so on. It's really about ensuring that what we speak about in Geneva has some relevance in Fiji. And that was, in fact, our greatest challenge. So that was the first very important agenda that we had in opening the mission. The second, and the very important, I'll only refer to this glancingly because it's not completely on the topic of the conversation today. The second was that we had a situation in the ILO with the unions. They had made a complaint under Article 26 of the Freedom of Association Convention of the ILO, and we were very close to our Commission of Inquiry coming to visit Fiji. And because when we arrived in Geneva, we had already ascertained what the Human Rights Council was all about and the need for Fiji to have membership, we knew that having a situation in the ILO which was going to question our commitment to trade union rights was going to affect our ability to become a member of the Human Rights Council. So we couldn't do both together. We needed to sort it out, we needed to have a good compromise solution, a negotiated result, and then we could focus on the Human Rights Council. And then, of course, I was appointed chief negotiator of COP. So that was in the very year that we were supposed to go for membership of the Human Rights Council. So we had to put it off for a year because of that. But eventually, we've now become members for the first time. Very significant for Fiji, very significant for the Pacific, because this is also the first time for the Pacific, a small island state in the Pacific, to become a member of the Human Rights Council. And we were asked over and over again in our campaign, what difference is this going to make to the Pacific? And my answer has always been, every Pacific Island country is unique. And we can't pretend that any one rhetoric is a Pacific rhetoric. For one country, gender empowerment may be a big issue. For another country, it may be about economic and social rights. Whatever it is, the fact is that the Pacific's voice has not been heard on the Human Rights Council. And it's still underheard because in Geneva, we have only the Solomon Islands mission, the Vanuatu mission, and the Fijian mission. And now finally, both Vanuatu and the Solomons have ambassadors. Previously, they just had chargés. And chargés cannot do the sorts of things that ambassadors could do. So it was important that they had proper presence in Geneva, and now we have 3 missions there. So the significance then of the kind of conversations we started to have, of course for the first few months we just sat and listened, because I personally didn't come from the diplomatic world. I was a lawyer in my last life, and so therefore learning how the Human Rights Council operates was a revelation to me. And to be honest with you, I couldn't understand why you spent so many hours saying how wonderful you were as a country. All these people, when talking about disabilities, you wouldn't believe there's any problem in the world, because every country sounded as though it was perfect. But I knew we were not perfect. And so I thought, I think it's time for a level of honesty in this room. So and then when Fiji started to intervene very cautiously, we started to say things like, we are still working very hard to get water and sanitation to our villages and our rural areas, and we don't have it. And these are the barriers that we are experiencing. When we're having a debate about the right to vote, we used to say, yes, everybody in principle in Fiji has the right to vote if you're over 18, but if you're a rural woman and you've had limited education and you can't actually get to the ballot box because the roads are so bad and there's no boat to take you, what use is the right to vote? And we gave that as a good example of the way that civil and political rights have such a close connection to social and economic and cultural rights, that they are interdependent. You can't have one set at the expense of the other. And I really was surprised that there were people who were surprised when we started to say, but Fiji's not perfect. We are having problems. We really enjoy this debate because we're learning from you. And slowly we saw in the room that people really appreciated our level of honesty, that we weren't at all pretending to be perfect in any way. And there were some areas where I think what we said was quite astonishing. We spoke immediately before the representative from the Vatican. So there's a permanent representative for the Vatican in the Human Rights Council, the Holy See. And I had no idea he was going after me, but we were talking about freedom of religion. Very important in the context of Fiji right now. So on freedom of religion, I spoke about the secular state and what it meant, and why we had found in our own history in Fiji that when you have too close connections between the church and the state, how minority religions are disadvantaged because they feel that they are somehow second-class citizens. And immediately after me came the Holy See, and they said, oh no, you lose God if you go towards, we don't agree with secularism because you're going to lose God in governance. And so this was a very interesting conversation. Immediately after this debate, I got approached by some NGOs who represented freedom of religion, saying, this is fascinating, your discussion. And I said to them, why is it fascinating? It's happened in every country. If you go to any Muslim country, in the Middle East, you'll find that you're not allowed to be a Christian there. You're not allowed to have a church there. So why is this such an astonishing? I'm just telling you what happened in Fiji. So you see how our political history has helped to shape the debate, because we are being honest about our past. We say things like, we've had a difficult political history. We are struggling with a concept of equality. Or we say things like, it's not easy to be from the LGBTIQ community in Fiji, because there is a strong attitudinal pushback to the idea of equality for LGBTIQ. We come from a traditional society with strong religious views, but we do not support discrimination of anybody. So this kind of approach to human rights in Geneva has in its stead really led to, I think, more honesty from other countries as well. So this is very good. Of course, not every country is empowered by their capitals to admit that they have had mistakes in the past. But one example of a country which is very, very honest about its past is South Africa. Very honest about its racist past. So it's always good to have that kind of discussion in the room. And also some of the Eastern European countries have really shared their history, especially those that have fallen into conflict. You know, those have fallen into conflict and are coming out of it, like Somalia. So being part of that kind of world, where you have the ability as a small country from the Pacific, to not only to shape the debates, but to kind of encourage other countries to be honest about their past, admitting that in fact, you know, our honesty about our past is all very well to talk about now because we know it's the past. You know, whether we're going to be able to be consistently honest at all times about all our failings is the real test. So then, very importantly then, what does membership allow us to do? And how is this going to then change Fiji's position on human rights? First of all, we get to vote for the first time. So what does this actually mean? The Human Rights Council work can be divided into three categories. One is the interactive debates and discussions. So these are often 3 panel discussions in a day with different themes. So on one day you can have a panel discussion on persons with disabilities, you can have a panel discussion on gender empowerment, and one on climate change, all in one day. And Fiji has been contributing to each. And what do? We say this is what we're doing in Fiji, best practice. However, we are having these problems. And we really look forward to hearing from the panel, because there's usually a high-level panel with a special mandate holder on that area on the panel. So we say we really appreciate hearing from the panel how you can help us with this problem. That's been our approach. And it's always been very helpful, actually. And one area in which it's been really helpful is gender empowerment and the intersectionality of gender with culture, with religion, with disability. That kind of discussion is really useful. We're not the only country where, you know, a woman with disabilities might be disadvantaged in a particular way and different from a woman of a different sexual orientation, for instance, in a disaster, for instance. So we're not the only country, and there are other countries, and we've really shared good practices. But one issue where I think, you know, we need to have a really good discussion about in the future is climate justice. Now, you mentioned that, you know, the climate justice may not be a very good word, but I actually think it's, with the greatest respect to the United Nations, I think it's a really, really good way of approaching the issue of an inclusive national and social role to climate change. I think this word justice is really about fairness. And so when we're facing in the world this incredible change, where the planet is at risk, and therefore all our communities are at risk, and we are in the Pacific facing a particular urgent change as a result of climate change, I think that we simply cannot do this without everybody agreeing that this is what we need to do. And everybody includes the vulnerable. Now, who is vulnerable in a particular situation is going to be different depending on the situation. I really hesitate to say all women are vulnerable. I just don't think that all women are vulnerable all the time. It depends on the situation. It is true that women are more likely to be vulnerable in a situation of emergency than men. That we know to be true, because people don't see the women in the room when they're talking about trying to adapt to an emergency situation. But I think that, you know, actually climate justice is about climate change mitigation and adaptation, and ensuring that we see everybody in the room, that we include them in our conversations, and we insist that the system works for them. So, you know, let's talk a little bit about justice in relation to gender. What do we mean by gender justice? And I think at the very basic level, it means asking. Foreign service regulations were drafted, they never saw the possibility that the diplomat is going to be a woman, a single mother, and in a country like Geneva, where nannies are not just, you know, flowering off the bushes. So we had to go back to capital and say, we have a situation. The cost of nannies is more than this diplomat's salary, actually, in Geneva. And how is she going to look after the baby? So while we were toing and froing, and I was talking about gender justice and all these emails, the baby was coming to the office. So then, how many workplaces allow babies to come to the office? And in how many workplaces are we all going to chip in and look after the baby so the diplomat can go to the meeting? So you see, the system was not working for all women. It might be working for a woman of my seniority, whose kids are grown up and so on, and whose husband's at home, and if there was a grandchild, the husband quite happy to look after the grandchild. But it wasn't going to work for the single mother. So for me, if you're talking about the term justice means, is the system working for everybody, especially the vulnerable? And who the vulnerable are in a particular situation depends on the situation. A situation makes a person in a wheelchair vulnerable because the situation was blind to the person in the wheelchair. And another example I give about wheelchairs is that, if there's a lift in government buildings and you've got a case on the 3rd floor in the Court of Appeal, you're not disadvantaged. You're going to go in the lift, you're going to go up, you take your wheelchair into the courtroom, no problem. But if the lift's not there or it's not working, and you say to everybody, we're all equal before the law, everybody has equal access to justice, well, that's meaningless, isn't it, for the person in the wheelchair, because the person in the wheelchair can't even get to the courtroom. So this is what I mean. When we look at justice systems, whether it's climate justice, whether it's justice from the point of view of gender, whether it's from the point of view of persons with disabilities, we ask ourselves whether in fact everybody has equal access. And I remember Justice Felix Frankfurter of the US Supreme Court, formerly of the US Supreme Court, who said, there is no greater inequality than the equal treatment of unequals. So the concept of treating everybody in the same way is completely out of fashion. It doesn't work. Now the only way to treat people is through the eye of justice. It's the only way. So if we translate that back to the Human Rights Council, that is the language that is now being spoken. Nobody is saying equality means treating everybody in the same way. Now people are saying that systems have to be adjusted according to historical disadvantage, according to equal access to justice, equal access to services. So I do this ethics training for new lawyers. Most of them about your age, I have to say. And one of the first questions I ask them is, what's your job? As a lawyer, what's your job actually? And actually, a lawyer's job is to give people access to justice. They are the window through which people are going to get justice. And if the lawyer charges a lot, isn't available, is rude to clients, doesn't do the job properly, the lawyer is a barrier to justice, actually. So this whole concept of justice ultimately is the one that has taken over the rights dialogue. It is this that is the center of the discussion. The other thing that is the center of discussion is intersectionality. The relationship between development and rights. The relationship, therefore, between the SDGs and rights. The relationship between New York and Geneva. So you know what happens in the UN world. Everybody happily does their work on the SDGs in New York, but when the Secretary General of the New York had this reform agenda, he completely forgot to mention the words human rights. And Geneva got really upset about it. The ambassador said, what, are you saying that in reforming the human rights, in the United Nations system, human rights are irrelevant? So there was quite a big meeting about it and everybody got very excited, but the SG did not change his reform agenda. So then there is, in my opinion, a lack of coherence within the UN. people-centered approach, the fact that women are important, indigenous people are important, children are important, to ensure that the system doesn't leave anybody out. And we're talking about justice, about making sure that institutions and systems don't leave anyone out. That's exactly what the SDGs say. So there you have the coherence between what happens in New York and what happens in Geneva, what happens in Bonn and what happens in Geneva. So what do I see as a priority for Fiji in the Human Rights Council? Coherence in the UN system. Reminding people sitting in Geneva that there's a whole world out there where the planet is at risk. And we need to put climate change right at the top of the conversations that we're having in the Human Rights Council. So for instance, in the UPR that we are participating in now, as we speak, Second Secretary Money in Geneva is participating in Cambodia's UPR, Vanuatu's UPR, and so on. And in every single UPR, we are saying, congratulations for the work you've done on climate change, but can we remind you that in anything you do in relation to climate change, please remember women, children, the elderly, persons with disabilities, indigenous people. We are saying this repeatedly over and over again in our UPR interventions with other countries. So we, as far as we're concerned, this is a priority. It's intersectionality. So it's climate change, human rights, disabilities, everybody, bringing everybody into this conversation. But it's also about using our influence as a member of the Council to really change the discussion on the UPR. The other thing about intersectionality, I did touch on this relationship between civil political rights and economic and cultural and social rights. That's a conversation that's very touchy. It's very controversial. Why is it controversial? So I asked a developed country, why don't you vote in favor of the resolution on the right to development? And the developed country ambassador said to me, because you developing countries are using lack of development as an excuse not to give people civil and political rights. So I realized that in fact there's a divide in the Human Rights Council between economic, social and cultural rights and civil and political rights. If you analyze the UPR questions, you'll see that the developed countries are the ones who are asking, why haven't you got freedom of association? Why haven't you got freedom of the media? Why haven't you got independence of the judiciary? And if you look at the developing countries, they're asking things like, what are you doing about the right to education? What are you doing about the right to health? So there's a divide. It's getting better, and recently Denmark has led a charge to bring the SDGs and human rights together. But there's two sticking points. The words in the, and I would really urge all of you to start looking at the resolutions of the Human Rights Council and to see how Fiji's voting on it. If you want to keep an eye on us, and you should, then you should see how we're voting on these resolutions. The right to development, which is moved by China, and remember the SDGs and development, SDGs and human rights is led by Denmark, developing country. China is leading the charge on the right to development, but the right to development does not use the word sustainable. In addition to that, if you look carefully at that resolution, it talks about the right to development being vested in a country. So it's the right of Fiji to develop. Whereas, if you look at the first declaration on the right to development, which came, I think, in 1986 from the General Assembly, it actually talked about the right of development as the right to the individual. I am an individual, I have the right to health. And if I don't get the right to health, I can sue the government. So this is what the ideological divide is actually in the Council. My own thoughts on that is, they are both correct. The right to development is an individual right. And in fact, that's reflected in our Constitution. The right to health, the right of education, all of these are enforceable against the state. But also, if you look at the underdeveloped stage of many developing countries, we have not been underdeveloped by choice. A lot of it has been our colonial history. And so therefore, the other very interesting conversation is, if we are underdeveloped, to what extent do we have the right to seek assistance from the developed world? And this is about the politics of aid, development aid. And this is what, of course, developed countries are uncomfortable with. They're uncomfortable with because they don't like this word right to development. When they give aid, we are doing you a great favor. But a lot of developing countries say, no, you're not. We're underdeveloped because of you. and your colonial actions. And you have a duty now to render justice. So you see how controversial this word justice suddenly becomes if you see it in the context of development. Because if you ask why are we losing our coastlines, what the Pacific Island countries are saying is not our fault. Not our fault. We don't even have a carbon footprint. So then let's talk justice. And this is when it becomes very controversial, because when people start talking about loss and damage, they're talking about litigation. And this is very uncomfortable a topic. So what do we do in those circumstances? As I've said before, I really don't think we can get rid of this word justice, because justice is about fairness and equity. I also think that it is very close to this whole discussion about the right to develop. And Fiji's position on the right to development is both ways, individual and as a nation. So I don't think in any way that we're going to drop this word, justice, from our discussions. But I do think that on the discussion on the right to development, we are really going to have opportunities for Fiji to move this conversation forward. First of all, Fiji is not a threat to anybody. We're just a small island developing state, but we've made our mark as leaders in the world. But also, you know, the interest that follows special and differential treatment in the WTO as well as the Human Rights Council and the climate change world, this has come as a result of discomfort with the positions of China and India. So Fiji is not part of that. You know, we're a Pacific Island country. You know, we're not in any kind of state of development or transition that some of these larger developing economies have. So we can in fact speak in quite a forthright way about this concept of development and human rights. So that's a very important conversation. I think Fiji can contribute very well to that conversation. The last, and I think that this is a really important conversation and one which I think all of you have a very important interest in, and that is the relationship between culture and rights. So in many UPRs, if you sit there day after day, many countries say, we can't give gender empowerment in the way that you're recommending because it's against our culture. We can't abolish corporal punishment. It's a very important one. We can't abolish corporal punishment because in our culture we believe in corporal punishment and we're not going to change that. So then what is going to change that? So what has Fiji's response been? When we responded to the UPRs of countries in the Pacific, this is what we said. We said, we hear you on culture. In Fiji, we have the deepest respect for culture, and we really believe that our cultures give us a sense of identity. However, we understand also that human rights transcend culture, that human rights are universal. Otherwise, you know, we wouldn't be supporting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so therefore, what we have done in Fiji is we have taken bold political and judicial leadership to really make decisions which urge the modification of cultural practices which discriminate against others. So let's just talk about something that's really been controversial in Fiji. LGBTIQ rights. So, you know, when the Mokoska case came before the courts, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Mokoska case. It happened years ago. It was a case under the 1997 Constitution. The judge who heard it was a New Zealand judge. And he said in his judgment, if I were to go out there and ask the public, what do you think about gay people? The majority of people in Fiji will say, against God. We don't want you to strike down the sodomy laws. But I'm a judge. I don't respond to public opinion. That's the value of the judiciary being given the right to strike down laws which are discriminatory, because I don't have to go to the ballot box. I only have to do what is right according to the law, even when it's unpopular. And so my decision is that the sodomy laws in the penal code are contrary to international human rights, both in terms of the right to privacy and the right to equality, and I'm striking that section down. And to give credit to subsequent governments, The current government at the time and subsequent government, nobody tried to bring that one back. So sodomy is still not an offence in Fiji. So what is very interesting about that particular case is this. You know, actually leadership changes human rights discourses. And we can't live in fear that we've done something for the last 200 years and we're not going to change it. And you know, we ratified CEDAW, and one of the articles in CEDAW says that we have a duty to modify practices, cultural practices which discriminate. Just today I opened the papers and I see Justice Garner is saying, okay, traditional reconciliation for rape, I'm not impressed. Why isn't he impressed with traditional reconciliation for rape? Because, first of all, the judges consider it to be an abusive process, trying to get out of the court hearing. And secondly, this is not a practice which is intended to be part of the justice process. It is a process which helps the community to live in peace. So they're not killing each other because, you know, you raped my daughter. That's the purpose of the traditional practice, is to help the community heal. It's not supposed to be stopping the court process. So, we've changed. 20 years ago, we wouldn't be talking like this. We have changed, and we must change. And Fiji can actually really lead on that discussion. And this is something that you all can do here in Fiji. How do you change the way society sees things we've done for the last 300 years? You know, people oppose it. Look at corporal punishment. People go, oh, well, culture. What culture? If you ask an elderly man from the Chinese community, an elderly man from the Indo-Fijian community, an elderly man from Kiribati, what do you think about smacking children? They'll all say, oh yes, it's a very good thing, we should carry on doing it. This newfangled idea of abolishing corporal punishment is very, very bad. They say the same, it doesn't matter what culture they come from, right? It's not to do with culture at all. It's to do with patriarchy, actually. And patriarchy cuts across all cultures. Itoke, Indo-Fijian, all of us. So then you need to change that discourse. There's a lot of discussion out there about corporal punishment. 3 Pacific Island countries in the UPR have refused to abolish corporal punishment. We need to change that in the Pacific. This is not good enough to be bashing kids at school and expecting them to learn in those circumstances. And never mind whether it's good or bad, we have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child prohibits corporal punishment. And it's in our Constitution that it's prohibited. So then, really, you know, the young need to speak out. That, you know, it doesn't work for us. It doesn't work for us. 10 years ago, this was happening to us, and it has never worked for us. It has not helped us to learn. So the young need to get quite outspoken about issues of intersectionality, of cultural rights, and other types of rights in relation to equality, about gender, about the rights of children. And you know, also in Fiji, this business about not asking children anything, not involving them in decisions, not allowing them to speak out in any kind of forum. I mean, we've all accepted it. We all grew up like this. It's no longer valid. And it no longer works, because actually the greatest wisdom that I've heard are from the voices of children. So I would say that then the third area of important change that we can make together in Geneva and here in Fiji is to change the discussion about the empowerment of people, and especially children. And to talk about how justice and rights and culture work together. It's very hard to challenge culture, I know. I know it very well because I come from a traditional society. And you know, you'll get laughed at, you'll get resisted, but ultimately things do change simply because you've spoken out once. So I really admire you, because for me it's youth leaders ultimately who are going to hold that change in their hands much more than we in Geneva. And so one way in which we can work together is for you to keep an eye on what we do in Geneva. Watch the resolutions which are about to be debated. So if there is a resolution on violence against children or violence against women, you can urge me to support it. And if there is a resolution about which I know nothing in third committee, for instance, and I have to say that twice in the last third committee hearing, NGOs told me, one Amnesty, one Human Rights Watch, told me about a resolution that was coming up in third committee, which I had no control over because third committee is looked after by our New York mission, saying, be careful, Fiji, we think you should know that this resolution's coming up and you should warn your people in New York to support this resolution. And so, you know, they tipped me off. I tipped off Prune in New York and we supported the resolution. And, you know, going back to Sogi rights, you remember that there was the appointment of the first special rapporteur on Sogi 2 years ago, I think it was, Vitit. And it was very controversial. There was blood on the floor in the Human Rights Council and so on. Then there was an attempt to stop it in third committee. We were tipped off by Nolene. Exactly, saying they're about to stop that. They're about to stop the appointment of the special rapporteur in third committee. Now, we had no right to vote in the Human Rights Council because we weren't members. We were observers, so we didn't vote. But we did have a vote in third committee. So we tipped off our ambassador in New York. It was then Ambassador Danivalu. We said, Ambassador Danivalu, do not stop. Make sure we do not vote against or abstain on this resolution. We need to support the appointment of the special rapporteur. And we did. So do it. Do it with me. You need to be able to contact me, tell me, resolution coming up, need your support. And you know, we may not always get instruction from Capital to support, but at least what you can do is bring it to my attention, bring your, and don't hesitate to give your point of view. We think Fiji should support this resolution because A, B, C, and by all means throw at us our constitution. You know, we can't be hypocritical and have something in our constitution when the thing comes up in the Human Rights Council, we're looking the other way. The other thing that you really need to know, sorry I don't have a copy because I gave the only copy I had to the Minister this morning, but online you will find the Human Rights Council brochure. And at the end of the brochure are a list of our voluntary pledges, things we promise to do as members of the Human Rights Council. Hold us to those promises, publicly if you like. After all, if you become a member of the Human Rights Council, you have a responsibility to society. So by all means, say to us, but you promised that you're going to support the UN mechanisms on human rights. Why aren't you supporting the resolution on Yemen, where people are starving? So let me now turn to the country-specific resolutions. There are two sets of resolutions in the Human Rights Council, and I think some of you are very well aware of this. One set of the country-specific, one set of the thematic. The thematic resolutions are relatively straightforward and easy because most of the thematic resolutions have mirrored in our constitution the equivalent rights. So if there's a resolution on the right to water and sanitation, for instance, we will support it as long as it's asking for something which is consistent with our constitution, as long as it's not watering down the right which is in our constitution. So sometimes in the negotiation process, the negotiations water down rights. We don't like that. We're not going to support something that is a weaker version of our constitution unless we can really live with it, because politically we've decided that if we don't support it and it's not voted in favour, then we won't get the resolution on water and sanitation out at all, which is worse. So we have to make difficult decisions during the negotiations. However, for thematic resolutions, generally we will support them, including the right to development for the reasons that I've already told you. And there's some really interesting resolutions that are coming up under thematic. The role of businesses and human rights. You know, that's a really interesting area, and I would really urge you to have a look on the OHCHR website to see how that discussion has emerged. To what extent does the private sector have a responsibility of promoting human rights? That's important and is reflected in our constitution. So we will support any resolution that encourages the private sector to promote human rights. Another one for thematic resolutions, which is really very important for Fiji, is on the role of human rights institutions. So national human rights institutions have a very focal role. And this year, you're going to see the HRADC in Fiji playing a particularly important role because it's the year of our UPR in November. So the HRADC's job is to get civil society together to write the shadow report. So then what should a national human rights institution look like? How important is it that governments must not interfere with the national human rights institution? How do you balance the role of a national human rights institution to advise government when it thinks government's about to go off the rails on something, with the power of most national human rights institutions to sue the government, to bring a human rights case to court, as is the case in Fiji? And I would suggest that you look very closely at the cases that have come before the courts brought by the HRADC. Many of them are about prisoners' rights, and that's very important, another area of work for us. But it's also about children's rights, and that's very important for you. Especially there was one very significant decision which the High Court upheld on the rights of children in custody, in police custody. The right not to be held in custody, in fact. A very good decision. I would urge you to have a look at it. So that kind of thematic resolution is very important for Fiji's future. So I would keep an eye on every resolution that is being negotiated, starting from this one, from February and March, and just to trace Fiji's voting pattern on it. And if you can't understand why we didn't vote in favor of a particular one, by all means ask us. But I can tell you now why we might not support one. If the resolution is urging other countries to ratify some optional protocol or a convention, and we haven't ratified it ourselves, we feel a little embarrassed in those circumstances. It's a bit hypocritical, right, to ask everybody else to ratify something we haven't done ourselves. And of course the answer to that is that we should quickly start ratifying things. And we are. Two conventions left, which we hope to ratify this year. The other reason why we might hesitate before we support a resolution is when we feel that during the negotiations it's been watered down so much that it's rendered the right useless. And for that, I think we would be very much guided by other countries which have, like us, a strong focus on the intersectionality of the two sets of rights. But generally speaking, I think you'll find we don't break a consensus on thematic resolutions, and number two, that we would probably support most resolutions in the Council. So that's going to be interesting this year. Country-specific situations. So for all of you who've been following Fiji's conduct overseas, you'll find that generally Fiji has abstained on country-specific resolutions, partly because Fiji likes to be looked at as being neutral. But this year, that's going to have to change, right? We've become members of the Council. We've said in our voluntary pledges that we will support the mechanisms of the Human Rights Council. This means the special mandate holders, the independent experts, the commissions of inquiries that go into other countries and write reports, and the High Commissioner when she makes a report to the Council. So a very important issue, and we're still working around this. Ultimately, this is a decision that will be made by Cabinet. So what I'm about to say is subject to Cabinet's decision. But what we are now working around is how do we decide how to vote on a country-specific resolution. We don't want to be going poking our noses into other countries' business, actually. We don't. We didn't like it when other countries were doing it to us, so we're not inclined to do it to other countries. But there must come a time when the violations of human rights are so serious and are of so much concern to the international community, and where action is recommended by the OHCHR, by the special mandate holders and the commissions of inquiry which go and visit these countries, that we cannot look the other way. We owe it to the international community, to the men, women and children of that nation. So of those country-specific resolutions, some of those will already be supported by the country concerned. And the ones that are supported by the countries concerned will be those resolutions which have a focus on capacity building and technical support. So for instance, Somalia supports the last resolution on Somalia because it's about helping the Somalian government to build transitional justice. So the UK government, which originally moved that resolution and called for action against Somalia, now Somalia has reached a place where Somalia agrees with the mechanisms of the UN within the country. That's a very good thing. Another country that's made really good progress as a result of the UN mechanism is Cambodia. Another one is the Ukraine, Georgia. These are good stories from the Human Rights Council, and Fiji should be proud to support those stories. But the tricky ones, of course, are the ones where the country does not agree. The country is saying, don't come here, you're not welcome. Myanmar is an example. Myanmar's independent mechanism against Myanmar has just been mandated by the Human Rights Council in September, October last year. And that came as a result of an unprecedented partnership between the EU and the Organization of Islamic States. Unprecedented. But they agreed that something's got to be done about the Myanmar situation in relation to the Rohingya. So there is a resolution about that, but Myanmar doesn't agree with it and will not allow the mechanism to visit Myanmar. So then how will Fiji vote on that is going to be very interesting. I can't tell you now because this is subject to a cabinet decision, but I can suggest to you that you should follow us very carefully to see whether in fact we are having a very clear voting pattern and whether we are living up to the pledges that we made when we went to this campaign. So that is really a summary. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but that's really a summary of the work that we intend to do, the priorities that we have, the ways in which you can help our work and to further this conversation on implementing human rights here in Fiji. We recognize this focal role of civil society, cannot do this without you. And also our work is useless without you, actually. If you're not here, then all I am doing in Geneva, right, is empty talk. Doesn't mean anything to the people of Fiji. And that is not in anybody's interest. So that really is a summary, and I suggest now that we have a general discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador. You've really given us a very comprehensive summary of your work, and on the concept of justice and human rights and equity and intersectionality. So thank you so much. Maybe we'll just go around if given the very limited time that we have.
Do we talk too much? Half an hour. Half an hour.
So we'll just open up the floor if anyone has a question.
Some of the attendees who are new?
Yes, so some of the attendees are new. Raid, he's an environmental science student. Kamal, who works at the University of South Pacific. Michael works for the British Council. And Blake and Apilis are at the back, who are university students. So basically, this is just a really tiny representation of the network, because we have over 170 members around the country, including in rural and marginal countries. Would anyone have any questions? Any questions from the...
Just Ambassador Khan, thank you for your comprehensive update. Just a reflection, in fact, on the 102nd session of the ILC. I was actually there. I was working for ILO back then, and with the ILO team, and I felt like there was one time where the youth voices or voices of trade unions was kind of disfranchised, that like being there and not being able to speak, being an employee of the UN at that time, particularly because the right to organize, the freedom of association article, ILO Convention 87, at that time it was the non-observance by the Fiji government, and there was a MOU that was supposed to be signed at that very moment, and what happened in Geneva while being there amongst them really disheartened me as a person, like as an individual, as a citizen of Fiji, and just sharing that experience, like how they couldn't come to a tripartite agreement, and then coming back to Fiji and then shelving the commission of inquiry and reading the news. I left ILO at the time when Mr. Lamotte had left the country as well, and I joined a international charity. But I always feel like as individuals or as young people, we are not informed in great detail about what had happened actually in Geneva, what's actually translating into practice in Fiji. Are we actually doing what the MOU had mandated or what they agreed on? So your comprehensive update actually like tells me what happened in Geneva, but when they came back to Fiji, and when I talk to the trade unions, because I still am friends with them, I feel there's still some like clear divergence, and they are on two separate sides of the page. So as a citizen of this country and as a concerned citizen as well, we hope that at some time they can put behind this maybe it's an ego issue or whatever the political differences is, the parties that they represent, and they can come because it's really affecting young people as well. As a young person, the minimum wage is still low. They have raised it only to a certain level. It's still not enough to put food on the table for some families. And going to the villages, we do a lot of community work, and we see the wage that they are paid, and even lobbying for that wage, and taking the streets and being pushed out of the streets. These are things that actually hinder our voices. And I feel that as AFG, as a network, we need more information and the right to information. And it's good that you're very out front and outright about the information that you get, and the way you present it to us as citizens in this country, and the way we have that opportunity to access it directly from you. And I'm thankful for that. Like that you're allowing us to contact you directly to urge you to support a resolution. Most of our ambassadors don't do that, so I'm truly grateful for that.
Okay, I'm really glad you raised the issue of the ILO, because when we opened the mission, we had the situation with the ILO. I can't remember whether you were in the room when I mentioned that we walked into a situation with the ILO in relation to Article 26 of the Freedom of Association Convention. And what was very apparent to me, because I was completely new to the ILO scene, is that this tripartite way of doing things was really going to be quite unique. I mean, it's not the way that any other international organization operates, and that there's no way, unlike other international organizations, that the ILO was simply going to accept government's point of view. That was one very important thing. The second very important thing is that Fiji was in the Asia Pacific group, and the Asia Pacific group was divided on whether or not it was going to support Fiji's position. If you remember, Fiji at that time was going through a period of reform, and still is. So the third thing is this, that there was a divergence of opinions as to eligibility for political leadership, and also a divergence of opinion on things like freedom to demonstrate, freedom of association, and so on. So what I learned from all of that is that you're not going to solve anything without talking to people, even people you don't like particularly much. And also that ultimately what broke that situation which we were facing was dialogue. Our minister at that time, the trade union representative, Mr. Anthony, and Mr. Hazelman, they got together and they talked all day, and I can't tell you what they talked about because I wasn't in the room. The idea was we facilitated the dialogue and we left them to it. I understand it was not an easy exercise. It was quite painful at times, but they talked, as a result of which there was an MOU, which then there was a backing from when they came back. Then there was a mission that came to Fiji, and then finally they agreed to an MOU, and now I hear in the papers that the trade unions are walked out of ERAB, and ERAB is one of the mechanisms. So I can only say what I said before, I've been saying it consistently. No problems are ever solved anywhere unless you talk. And talk in a way where you're listening. We're all so good in Fiji at talking, aren't we? But we're not listening. So that to me is absolutely crucial, and the Geneva mission will continue to work very hard at proceeding with dialogue. Not just in the labour front. When we had our last UPR, a number of NGOs came to the UPR in Geneva, and our UPR was headed by the heads of agencies, including the Attorney General and the Chief Justice and the DPP. We invited the civil society members to the mission for the first time, and everybody was very tense about this. How's this going to work? Here we're going to sit at the same table as government. We haven't done this before, but there was a bit of bloodletting, but it worked really well. It was a good discussion. So I believe in it. I believe that it helps to solve problems, to break the ice, and I think that this is actually right in the center of the ethos of the ILO, understanding and dialogue. So with the situation now, we will continue to promote it, and Mr. Guy Ryder, the ILO DG, knows that the Geneva mission believes very firmly with that and works closely with us for that purpose, as does his staff. So I am very hopeful that any difficulties we have in relation to labour reform, that we have the capacity also to solve them through dialogue.
5 minutes to 4. And, would there be any other last burning questions?
So, just a question. Now that Fiji is having their review in later on, and I'm CCF is facilitating one of the process of for the shadow report. How do young people engage in this space, especially having to work directly with the HDA, the human with Astrid Raj's office, especially at a time where a lot of things are happening around the honesty, the independence of such institution, how that they would soak in young people's contributions.
So we were having discussions with the HRADC and with government on our UPR report, and we want to change the way we do it this year. The last time, government just sat down and wrote the government report, and I understand there was a shadow report, and the UNOHCR wrote its own summary. But we want to have a little bit more of an inclusive and participatory approach. So we've approached an organization called UPR Info, based in Geneva. And we've said, can you come and do a session here in Fiji in April? Part of it is going to be spearheaded and participated in by civil society. And I would urge you to be part of that. And the second is to help the government stakeholders to write the government report. So ultimately the responsibility for the writing of the reports are yours. For the civil society, yours, and government, theirs. I mean, nobody can help us. Nobody can write the reports for us. But I think it's really important that we have a better understanding of our roles at the UPR. And that in April, you should look forward quite soon for a session in April where you are invited to have a discussion, firstly with HRADC, facilitated by UPR Info, and then in the same room as government. So everybody understands. Nobody is expecting you to sit in the pocket of government. Of course, that would be quite self-destructive if you were to, the whole purpose of the shadow report is accountability for government. But at the same time, I think it's a really good idea if this discussion were to be as constructive as possible. And to have a constructive discussion where we actually do disagree with each other, in my mind, is a good way to approach the UPR this year. And if you are going to be the UPR, and I would really encourage a strong youth voice at the UPR in November, then please do expect to be invited to the mission. But again, we don't expect you to agree with the things we say, of course not. That's not the role of civil society, but important that we can at least talk. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you so much for the questions as well. So maybe I'll just give this final few minutes to Imam to probably just keep forward to these young leaders, and how to see how you can be more actively and really engage in not only the implementation but also the monitoring and the review of human rights here in Fiji and also in the Pacific.
Okay, so one of the pledges in our Human Rights Council campaign was that we will support a national treaty body mechanism, not just for the writing of the reports, but also for monitoring how well we're doing for implementation. What we have in mind is to work with Ashley at RRT on a database which will set out a matrix of all the things we promised to do at the UPR, for instance. All the things we promised to do, the CEDAW report. All the things we said we were going to do, CRC report. It's a good way of everybody seeing how well we're doing. So if we've fallen back on some commitment, then by all means, you should be saying to government that you said you were going to do it and you haven't done it, and this was a promise made in your last UPR. Don't forget that the purpose of the third cycle UPR is exactly this, monitoring progress. So the same states that recommended for us to ratify the Convention on Enforced Disappearances are going to ask us again. We asked you to do it last time, you said you were going to do it, you haven't done it. Can we again ask you to ratify the Convention on Enforced Disappearances? So it's a good, I'm a great believer in the UPR. I think the UPR is one of the most effective mechanisms of the Human Rights Council. And our 2014 UPR is still referred to by many countries as a great success because of the way we approached it. First of all, we sent a delegation at a very high level. It's not much point in sending an ambassador to a UPR. The ambassador can't make any promises on behalf of the government. Really, you need a minister. Secondly, because of the systematic way in which we divided and classed the different kinds of recommendations. So all the ones on disabilities in one, and one person is going to respond. All the things on the rule of law, independence of the judiciary, either went to DPP or Chief Justice. So I think it's really important for implementation that once this website is out, the database is out, that you use that yourself. Even before that is up, the OHCHR has a matrix. If you go into the OHCR website and type in Fiji, you'll find that there's a matrix of Fiji's UPR commitments. So you really should use that. HRADC does on all of those commitments. And really the time is very short now, between now and our UPR. So the more prepared you are, the better it is. The better UPR we will all have. The other thing on implementing is this, that implementation work for civil society is very challenging for those civil society groups which are based in the urban areas. Because a lot of the best and the most important work is happening in the rural areas actually. And so, you know, for those of us who are very interested in climate change work and working with the communities, and making sure that when a community is being relocated, that there is true respect for human rights. I think it's really important that communities start to have civil society groups visiting them, understanding them, and really telling them what their rights are. And so many people in Fiji don't know their rights are. How does it work, and how much of it is enforceable? You know, when I speak to lawyers, I say your job is to make sense of the Constitution as well. So when you are giving everybody access to justice, remember that ultimately the people who are going to take these cases to court are you. You are going to take these cases to court. And so understanding how the justice system works, understanding that sometimes there's nothing left for people except the justice system. If you look at sexual and gender-based violence, that's an example. And I think also demystifying the effort. The justice system is a really important role of the civil society groups, making sure that they understand that judges and magistrates are there to work for society, not the other way around. So that's what I would say in summary about the importance of your work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shameem. On behalf of the Alliance for Future Generations and the many other young people who are joining us, I would like to extend our deepest appreciation and thanks for making this time available to meet with us and give us brief and I think very comprehensive insight into the work which you are doing and how young people from here in Fiji and also from can further support that, you know, to make society a better place to live in. So now I'll just ask the team to give our appreciation in the usual manner.
Time for a photograph?
Yes, we have a time for photograph. We have 11 minutes. Maybe we get someone from the top. Maybe while we're waiting, it's a good opportunity to also learn of some of the work.
Yes, I think that would be really wonderful. I'm actually fascinated by what the dentist does.
I'm fairly new to this group. I just joined, I think, a couple of days ago. So I just graduated last month, and so I've been quite involved in what the dental students have been doing. We just recently became members of the International Association of Dental Students. That's based in Geneva as well. Yeah, so what we're trying to do is, currently what we are facing is unemployment. Yeah, so there's lack of opportunities locally, so what we're trying to get our current graduates is to build their networks internationally. So we do get like opportunities overseas, like rather than not just depending on our own government for now. So yeah. Sorry? Yeah, we actually had a meeting with the government a couple of weeks ago. We told them that there's a need for dentists, and they said there's a need, but they cannot fulfill the need.
Ah.
Yeah, so still an ongoing process.
We just recently completed a stationary book drive.
Yes.
So it was a one book, one pen campaign that we ran for 3.5 weeks, and we managed to mobilize educational resources that has now supported over 120 young people.
Wow.
Yeah.
in Fiji.
All the way to Tavioni.
To Tavioni.
Yes.
So you see, this is exactly what I meant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the background of the people that were affected are mostly like those whose parents, I'm not supposed to even say this on record, but those that did not have parents at all, that do not live in this human world anymore. So most of them are the survivors. And the next, going forward on February 22nd, the AFG is partnering with British Council to deliver its first policy dialogue on the bridging the gaps between media freedom and human rights. So yeah, we hope that Mr. Raj would be one of the speakers. He's always supported the Valuing Voices project, which is about inspiring people to tell better stories through innovative art forms. So yeah, we hope that we continue this partnership with other organizations as well.
So time for well, we should have one taken, like maybe with us all sitting around the table.
Okay.
This is very